From the very beginning of Jujutsu Kaisen, a clear divide was established between Satoru Gojo and Sukuna. The two of them were representations of different eras of Jujutsu sorcery, and each of them had claimed that they were the strongest of their time. From the very moment that Gojo had utterly humiliated Sukuna during their first meeting, it was ingrained within our minds that the two of them were bound to clash once again. We can all assume that this rematch was going to be a fight to the death. This battle is between Sukuna, arguably the most powerful evil force in the story, against Satoru Gojo, the most powerful Jujutsu sorcerer currently alive. So now that it's been a few months since the conclusion of this epic battle, I want to analyze what exactly happened during the battle between Gojo versus Sukuna. While some people are very happy about the outcome of this battle, there are others who said that it came to a very controversial end. Despite all of this, we can agree that this battle is in fact one of the greatest within the medium of shonen, and honestly I'm really excited to give my thoughts on it by breaking down and analyzing this entire battle. Be sure to stick around until the very end of this video as I'll be explaining the implications of this fight on the larger story of Jujutsu Kaisen, as I explain where the story of Jujutsu Kaisen can go from here, and whether if this is in fact the ending of the battle between Gojo versus Sukuna. Because if fan speculation is true, then Gojo may not be dead just yet. If this is true, then we may just have to get ready for round 2 of Gojo versus Sukuna. So you don't want to miss a second of this exciting video, as we're about to break down the entirety of Gojo versus Sukuna. Discover the Undead Collection and be amongst the very first to join us on our journey over at getsuga.com. It's not an exaggeration when I said that this battle between Gojo vs Sukuna was one of the most highly anticipated fights in all of Jujutsu Kaisen. I mean, there is no other fight in the story that had quite the chokehold on Jujutsu Kaisen fans that Gojo vs Sukuna did, with Jujutsu Kaisen getting really popular thanks to the release of Season 1 and Season 2 of the anime. This battle between the most strongest Jujutsu sorcerer and the most evil cursed spirit led to the popularity of the Jujutsu Kaisen franchise skyrocketing to new heights. So before we get into the main event, let's talk about some key moments that had led up to this epic encounter. Things had really kicked off on the monumental day when Gojo was finally freed from the prison realm, and contrary to the numerous theories that are going on within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen and even amongst fans, Gojo did in fact leave the prison realm with his sanity intact. After escaping, he had immediately issued a challenge to Kenjaku and to Sukuna. At this point in the story, Sukuna was in possession of Megumi's body, and so it was determined that Gojo vs Sukuna was going to take place on the 24th of December. Gojo was quite confident in his own ability, which is why he had given his opponents under a month of prep time, because he didn't think that this additional time preparing would have changed their fates. Looking back at this retrospectively, I think that Gojo was really reckless here, because Sukuna had in fact regained his full power during that time. So after a 1 month time skip, December 24th finally comes around. A series author, Gege Akutami, immediately cuts to the action as he doesn't want to kill the momentum of Gojo's return by showing us weeks worth of training and filler content. As exciting as it was to finally see one of the most greatest battles in the story, we didn't really get to see Gojo during any of the downtime leading up to this fight, which means that we were robbed of the emotional moments of Gojo reacting to everything that had happened while he was trapped within the prison realm. I think it would have been cool to see Gojo interact with some of his students, and to see him even meet some of the Culling Game sorcerers. Either way, I think that Gege was caught in a tight spot here, and he just wanted to cut to the action in order to retain the attention of the audience. Because I'm not kidding when I said that Gojo was in fact sealed for over 1,000 real world days. So everyone was more than excited to see him get back into the action. So as the battle begins, Gojo, Old Man Gaku and Utahime make their way to the top of a building in Shinjuku. At the same time, Sukuna was standing atop of another building within the city with Ryomen, who was wondering when his fight with Sukuna was going to take place, because despite December 24th being the day of their epic encounter, neither of them had any knowledge of the time and place that this fight was going to take place. Sukuna didn't appear to be too bothered by Uraume's concerns, as he explains that he is no stranger to such challenges, and he responds that it doesn't matter what time and what place their fight is going to take place, because he is confident that he is going to find out eventually. So immediately after Sukuna finishes talking, he senses a great mass of cursed energy on a building in the distance, as he identifies this as Gojo's cursed energy. So the question of the time and place of their battle has just been answered, as Sukuna prepares to get ready to fight. So Gojo, Gaku, and Utahime were preparing to fire off the first shot as Utahime activates her cursed technique, and it's revealed that it's an ability that amplifies the cursed energy output of any sorcerer that she wishes. So it essentially gives them a massive but temporary power boost. No surprises here, she casts this technique on Gojo, who is preparing to fire off his signature move, Hollow Purple. Utahime performs an entire dance while Gojo's Hollow Purple, which originally had little to no incantation, ends up being empowered by a chant and a stance. This is reminiscent of a Kido spell from Bleach. So the combination of Utahime's full powered buff along with Gojo performing all of the chants and stances that are associated with releasing Hollow Purple, it ends up empowering the attack by up to 200%. And this is the incredible way in which Gojo had announced his presence to Sukuna. With Ijichi's barrier cloaking the massive amount of power that Gojo had built up, Sukuna was caught off guard and he could barely react in time to the massive void of destruction that was fired towards him. Now, I don't know if Gojo was expecting to instantly end the fight before it had even begun, but right at the onset of their battle, Sukuna had proved to be more than competent enough to handle this attack even with such short notice. This may have actually been the very first indication that Gojo was dealing with someone who was just slightly above his pay grade. Even saying all of this, the 200% powered up Hollow Purple did end up costing Sukuna a hand. So Gojo and Sukuna finally meet, and Gojo wastes no time in declaring to Sukuna that he is the challenger in this fight. This appears to be fair considering the fact that Gojo holds the title of the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer of the current era. Sukuna laughs at his comment as he tells Gojo that him getting caught off guard by his 200% Hollow Purple must be getting to his head, because in actuality Sukuna doesn't even regard this battle against Gojo as a matter of a challenger versus the challenged, as he refers to Gojo as a fish on the chopping board. This may have been the assumption that Sukuna possessing one of Gojo's students would have made Gojo hold back against Sukuna. Gojo clarifies the matter by saying that unfortunately for Sukuna, he has no problem with beating the hell out of Megumi because of how much he resembles Toji Fushiguro. Honestly, if there's one thing that I cannot help but to praise about this fight is how engaging and humorous the banter is between Gojo and Sukuna. It was really refreshing to see Gojo trolling Sukuna in such a dire situation. So both Gojo and Sukuna begin to trade blows, and honestly is nothing short of spectacular. Gege's ability to draw impressive fight choreography makes this section of the fight nothing but a delight to read, with Sukuna throwing out multiple dismantle slashes in a flurry of different punches and kicks. Meanwhile, Gojo is creatively using his curse techniques and his brute strength in order to take on Sukuna. Now the two continue to trade blows until Sukuna begins to use domain amplification in an attempt to get past Gojo's infinity. Now this leads into another series of exchanges where the two end up destroying a building as a side effect of their punches colliding. The two of them emerge from the rubble as Gojo tells Sukuna that he's definitely going to pin all of the damage done to the city on him. I recall when this chapter was released, people were assuming that the fight was going to end with the two of them becoming friends. This is all thanks to how they both appear to be relating with one another in this chapter. But yeah, as we get into the next chapter, any idea of wholesomeness between the two of them is completely dispelled. But as far as the first round of their fight goes, I really loved seeing Sukuna showing off his mastery of Jujutsu through his ability to use domain amplification in order to negate Gojo's infinity. And Gojo on the other hand had many conditions which could lead to him winning, but it's just a question of whether if he was willing to use them while considering the fact that Sukuna was still in possession of Megumi's body. You'll be glad to know that the entire battle between Gojo versus Sukuna was being streamed in-world by Meme, and it seems as though the world of Jujutsu Kaisen was just as excited to see this battle as fans who read the manga were. It's a pretty cool meta reference as to how Gege was aware of Gojo vs Sukuna being something that was highly anticipated in the real world, and how this fight was a major topic of debate amongst fans for many months. It was inevitable in such a crazy battle that if either of the combatants had any hope of winning the fight, they needed to activate their domains. Now the issue arises when you begin to speculate how would Sukuna's barrierless domain interact with Gojo's domain, which does in fact have a barrier. From the commentary of the fight to the people reacting in-world, it was evident that this battle between Gojo versus Sukuna was truly on a level of power that no other sorcerer was able to even comprehend. In shonen stories, when there are epic clashes like this, it gives the author an opportunity to explain more intricate details of the power system that they have established within the story. And Gojo vs Sukuna is no exception to this. And it's not before too long that we see a fantastic double spread of both Gojo and Sukuna saying the iconic lines "domain expansion" as they activate their domains and take us to the next phase of their fight. From the onset, it is clear that Gojo and Sukuna's domains are evenly matched. Ordinarily, this would mean that the two of them would need to resort to using their curse techniques in order to gain the upper hand over the other. This is in the hopes of being able to deactivate the domain expansion of the other. But when it comes to Gojo versus Sukuna, things are not quite so simple. Now, because of the range of Sukuna's domain extending beyond the border of Gojo's, the stalemate between the two domains only exists when the two had overlapped. But beyond that area, Malevolent Shrine was completely unchallenged in its activity, thus allowing Sukuna to rain multiple slashes on Infinite Void from the outside. And considering the fact that barriered domains are weak to external attacks, it was all that was needed to shatter Gojo's domain and to forcefully deactivate it. This was a devastating outcome to open the fight with, and it essentially meant that Gojo was doomed to lose no matter what. And it's a shame because this was simply due to the fact that Sukuna has a more advantageous domain by default. This, in my opinion, was one of the first signs in the story that there was a considerable skill gap between Sukuna and Gojo. Kusakabe of the Jujutsu squad explained that a domain without a barrier is like holding water without a bottle, and Maki described it like painting without a canvas. And this further goes to show how incomprehensible the level of Sukuna's mastery of Jujutsu is in comparison to what we've seen thus far within the story. Now that Gojo's domain Infinite Void has been completely shattered, there is nothing preventing Malevolent Shrine from taking effect on Gojo. This results in us seeing Gojo take a hit for the first time since the Hidden Inventory arc, and this is a clean slash across his neck that upon a first glance appears to have completely beheaded Gojo. Luckily, in the next chapter we learn that this is nothing but a flesh wound that Gojo is able to immediately heal with a reverse curse technique, but unfortunately he wasn't out of the woods just yet, because despite healing this initial attack, he was still stuck in Malevolent Shrine with no defenses and no cursed technique. And considering the fact that his teleportation ability was a byproduct of his curse technique, which meant that he was unable to teleport out of the range of Sukuna's domain. Now the situation is worsened by a rain of slashes that Sukuna unleashes upon Gojo. This ends up turning Gojo into a bloody mess, but in one of the most unhinged panels in the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen, while Gojo is being slashed apart by Malevolent Shrine, he finds relief in the fact that his curse technique is overwhelmingly stronger than Sukuna's. Aside from the fact that Gojo had made this statement during a very inconvenient time, it actually is pretty much true, because if the roles were reversed and if Gojo had won the domain clash, the battle would have instantly been over. This, in a sense, is Gojo making the best out of a bad situation and understanding that despite losing in a battle of skill, Gojo still in fact had far greater firepower than Sukuna. Gojo then takes off in an attempt to get out of the range of Sukuna's domain, but Sukuna still rains down slashes on him as the two of them intercept and they begin to trade blows once again. Sukuna notes that while Gojo had kept his reverse curse technique on full blast, he was still able to move very quickly. Gojo knew that once he had been caught within Malevolent Shrine, outside of escaping its range or damaging Sukuna enough to deactivate it, there was no other way of destroying the domain. Gojo then activates a simple domain, and this is a technique that none of his students or the other sorcerers were aware of. This allows him to negate Sukuna's sure hit effect, as he then gets some breathing room in order to heal himself. Throughout this battle, we see a level of flexibility within the Jujutsu power system, and it honestly blows my mind. It almost feels like the entire power system was created for this very fight and this fight alone. It's amazing how multiple concepts which were introduced much earlier on in the story are now seamlessly being integrated into this fight. While Gojo uses his simple domain to give himself enough time to heal battle, we cut back to the Jujutsu squad as Chozo notes that Gojo's current course of action is simply just delaying the inevitable. This is immediately confirmed as we cut back to the action as we see Gojo and Sukuna trading blows within his domain, as then the clash ends with Sukuna covering Gojo in even more slashes. This leads to Gojo once again needing to use a simple domain in order to heal himself. Now strangely enough, despite activating the simple domain, it appears as though he is no longer being able to heal his wounds. This leads the onlookers who are watching this fight to assume that Gojo has run out of cursed energy. Yuta all but rules this out because he knows that this is nowhere near Gojo's maximum output. Now the problem at hand is that Gojo is in a very difficult situation. With no cursed techniques and being stuck in an enemy's domain, he is pretty much just delaying the inevitable, with Sukuna unleashing his slashes periodically, which means that Gojo using a simple domain and to heal himself is pretty much putting a bandage over a bullet wound. So he needs to find a much more sustainable solution in order to get himself out of this situation. Then suddenly Gojo moves with superhuman speed and he catches Sukuna in a hold. Just as Sukuna realizes what on earth is going on, it's already too late as Gojo leans back and holds his fingers in that very familiar position and he blasts him at point blank range with his curse technique Red. Now with Gojo's body and curse technique restored by his unorthodox use of reverse curse technique, he's now ready for a second round of domain clashing against Sukuna. He goads Sukuna into expanding the range of his domain, and then right at that moment he reactivates his very own domain, and once again the two powerhouses clash. Gojo students who are watching on notice that Gojo has reversed his domain's conditions. This removes the weaknesses of his domain to external attacks. It's amazing how Gege is able to play around with the power system without making it feel contrived. So now that Gojo has set the precedent of being able to reset the conditions of his domain, it stands to reason that Sukuna should also be able to do the same. This leads to Gojo once again being in a disadvantageous position in their clash, which allows Sukuna to rain down even more slashes on Gojo as his domain is once again shattered. Now this time Gojo wastes no time in trying to cast a simple domain, and he uses a technique called the Falling Blossom Emotion. He uses this in order to severely lower the effects of Sukuna's slashes. Kusakabe recognizes that this is an anti-domain technique which is utilized by the three Jujutsu families. It's a great way to showcase the advantages of Gojo's lineage, as he is able to utilize special techniques that most Jujutsu sorcerers have only heard of in rumors. So at this point Gojo doesn't even bother healing himself as he jumps straight to restoring his curse technique and then right into another domain expansion. The tension of this fight was nerve-wracking. Gojo had just lost 2 domain clashes and he was still itching to get into another one. I think at this point we were all wondering just what makes Gojo think that he can win in a 3rd domain clash. It's not too long before we find out that once Gojo activates his domain again, his domain now extends far beyond its normal range as it engulfs multiple buildings in the area. It's a no-brainer that this was a very bad idea on Gojo's part, as it now makes it easier for Sukuna to smash through Gojo's flimsy barrier thanks to Gojo spreading it as wide as possible. But Gojo, being the unpredictable mad lad that he is, begins to rapidly shrink the new expanded domain, and he forcibly also shrinks it along with the malevolent shrine. This incredibly ends up removing the massive range advantage that Sukuna's domain has. Gojo shrinks his domain down to the size of a basketball, and this ordinarily wouldn't be possible, but thanks to Gojo's experience within the prison realm, it allows him to apply all of that into his Jujutsu sorcery. It's moments like this that truly make Gojo vs Sukuna such an unpredictable battle, and it elevates this fight to new heights. Gege applies the knowledge of concepts that he's introduced much earlier on in the story and mixes it with a level of ingenuity and creativity which truly makes this battle so engaging to read through. Now, as Gojo and Sukuna battle within the basketball-sized sphere, suddenly a large number of slashes erupt from the domains, as Yuta notes that Sukuna has also shrunken down his domain in exchange for a higher cursed energy output. This once again results in the worst case scenario, as Gojo's domain is shattered once again, but surprisingly after Gojo's domain collapses, so does Sukuna's. All of this happens over the course of 3 minutes, meaning that this was the amount of time that it had taken for Sukuna to destroy the reversed unlimited void. So this makes Gojo's first win, or rather his first stalemate against Sukuna in a one-on-one domain clash. But how does Gojo succeed in destroying Sukuna's domain? Well, while they were inside the domain, Gojo wasted no time in wailing on Sukuna and damaging him so heavily that he couldn't maintain his domain anymore. All the while this was going on, Sukuna was destroying Gojo's domain from the outside, meaning for the very first time in this fight, both Gojo and Sukuna were on even ground with no curse technique and no power. This means that if the two of them were to clash again, if Gojo manages to damage Sukuna enough before those 3 minutes are up, then Gojo would be able to land Infinite Void and pretty much win the fight. So following these domain clashes, Gojo and Sukuna resort to hand-to-hand combat and they begin to race across the city as they continue to exchange blows. Gojo begins to think about why Sukuna is only sticking to using Cleave and Dismantle instead of resorting to also using the 10 Shadows, or more specifically Mahoraga. Sukuna is avoiding using these abilities to such an extent that he intentionally inconvenienced himself during their last domain clash just to avoid using Mahoraga. While Gojo is thinking all of this, Sukuna smiles viciously as he is taking enjoyment in Gojo's confusion. In a series of what can be only described as alarming manga panels, we see Mahoraga's wheel slowly turn within a dark void and Gojo suddenly begins to bleed from his nose. In the following chapter, Gojo's nosebleed ends up being a nothing burger as he quickly wipes it away and then activates his domain expansion along with Sukuna again. Now with this much clearer 3-minute target in mind, we have an idea of what Gojo needs to achieve in order to seal his victory. The two waste very little time as they begin to trade blows once more, and once again we have nothing short of impeccable fight choreography by Gege here. If you pay attention during the clashes here, I'm pretty confident that Gojo was overall the stronger combatant, because in all of the times that these two have clashed, there is no instance in which Sukuna held the advantage over Gojo. So thankfully, once again, Gojo is able to beat Sukuna to the point of shutting down his domain, but again, Sukuna is also able to shut down Gojo's domain from the outside. This is absolutely insane as the two ended up stalemating each other once again. There is literally no time for breaks here as Gojo quickly uses the opening in order to punch Sukuna into a nearby pole as he then reactivates his domain. This appears to have been the perfect opening because the impact of that punch ended up delaying Sukuna from activating his curse technique by approximately 0.1 seconds. So once Gojo had activated his domain, it had allowed for Infinite Void to finally hit Sukuna. This is the first time in this entire fight that Gojo's domain expansion was able to hit its mark. Gojo was able to land a devastating blow on Sukuna's chest, which instantly collapses the Malevolent Shrine, and this means that Sukuna is now at the mercy of Gojo's domain. There is a very touching moment that happens here as Gojo says to himself that he needs to destroy Sukuna's organs as he needs to put him in a far worse state than Sukuna had put Yuji earlier on in the story. It's moments like this that reveal more about Gojo's inner character, and I wish that we got to see more of this in the story. Gojo is clearly keeping all of the sickening acts of Sukuna in mind during their fight, as he realizes that this is the very same monster who had put his students through so much trouble. Now unfortunately, moments like this are very few and far in between, and I wish that we got to see more of them in the story. The fight was all but over until one final variable that Gojo was dreading was finally revealed. In Sukuna's vulnerable moment, he ends up summoning Mahoraga. But not only was Mahoraga summoned, he was also summoned while already having an immunity to Infinite Void. We are not even allowed a second to process how or why he's immune before he drops his sword of extermination and he shatters Gojo's domain. This back and forth fight leads to Sukuna taking the advantage. As Gojo quickly attempts to figure out what has just happened, he begins to think about how it's possible for Mahoraga to have been able to adapt to Unlimited Void without having been summoned. Especially when you consider the fact that Sukuna had only been hit for Unlimited Void for 0.1 seconds, so it rules out the idea that Mahoraga would have been able to adapt within that time. After Gojo does some quick thinking and thanks to the help of his 6 eyes, he figures out that while Sukuna was completely unaffected by the domain expansion, Megumi Soul on the other hand wasn't. So it was Megumi who had taken the hit as well as taking on the burden of adapting to Unlimited Void. This kind of explains why Sukuna never uses any other curse technique aside from from his domain exclusive ones, because he was already summoning Mahoraga, or rather his wheel, throughout the entirety of this fight. Now you can see the rage in Gojo's eyes as he makes this discovery. Sukuna, who would never miss a chance to twist the knife even further, asks Gojo if there's something that he wants to say. Gojo realizes this was just Sukuna trying to get under his skin, and so he decides to jab back at him for being a tryhard. Now with the banter out of the way, the next phase of the fight is about to begin. Gojo puts his mind to use as he deduces that although Megumi had taken the hit which was needed to adapt to Unlimited Void, neither Megumi nor Sukuna held the immunity to Infinite Void. This means that he would literally need to summon Mahoraga every single time that Gojo activates his domain, in order for Sukuna to save himself from the effects of it. After Gojo explains to Sukuna that he isn't out of the woods just yet, he attempts to use his domain expansion once more. He is hit with a very sharp pain in his head, which leads to an instant nosebleed. This is where we find out that Gojo has literally been pushing himself to the verge of death every time that he had decided to use a reverse curse technique. So it's no exaggeration to say that Gojo was essentially destroying and restoring his brain every time that he was doing this. His last domain expansion was the breaking point. If he ended up pushing himself any further, he would have either died from the brain damage, or he would have become so disorientated that he would have been unable to fight. So once again, it's a bad situation for Gojo, with Mahoraga being immune to Infinite Void. Now at the same time, Gojo has lost the ability to use his domain for the duration of the fight. So while reading this, I remember feeling like all of Gojo's hard work had been for nothing. Not because he wasn't strong or fast enough, but because he was constantly being outplayed by Sukuna. So when Sukuna started to go on a rant on how Gojo was lucky to have been born in a generation where Sukuna didn't exist, I genuinely had assumed that Gojo was as good as dead, because all Sukuna really needed to do here was to waste enough time playing with Gojo until Mahoraga had also adapted to his infinity, which pretty much would have spelled the end for Gojo. So what happens next is Sukuna activates his domain, but it instantly collapses. This is pretty much a first within this fight. Despite Sukuna going on about Gojo's brain damage, it seems as though he has sustained a good amount of brain damage himself after he was exposed to Infinite Void for 0.1 seconds. This once again proves the point that I made earlier, that Gojo is outright stronger than Sukuna. Despite the barrage of slashes from Malevolent Shrine, Gojo had endured all of it, but on the other hand, Sukuna experienced 0.1 seconds of Gojo's power, and that was enough to cause him enough brain damage to prevent him from using his domain. So now the two of them were entering the next phase of the fight without being able to use their trump cards. Now I think that this is clearly more of a problem for Sukuna than it is for Gojo, because Gojo still has a far more deadly arsenal even without his domain. Now with the two of them on a mostly even plane, they once again begin to trade blows. Gojo literally drags Sukuna across the pavement and flings him away with incredible force. Now before Sukuna can try to regain his footing, he is hit with a barrage of rocks that smash into him. This is thanks to Gojo's blue cursed technique. You have to remember that this is all happening while Sukuna was still manifesting Mahoraga's wheel, meaning that whatever curse technique Gojo would use here would start to feed Mahoraga's adaptation. Under normal circumstances, this is what would have happened, but we know that Gojo has been using domain amplification, which causes Mahoraga's wheel to darken, as it interrupts the adaptation process. It's no secret that Jujutsu Kaisen has been inspired by Hunter x Hunter, and Gojo even uses a version of Killua's rhythm echo against Sukuna, and he even uses an iteration of Gon's Janken-kun earlier in the fight. It's remarkable how this fight is pretty much a celebration of all of the stories that Gege loves. So as both Gojo and Sukuna continue to exchange blows, it becomes clear that Gojo isn't just the overall stronger combatant when it comes to his curse technique, but he's also the better fighter. Because so far, Sukuna hasn't even landed a single clean punch on Gojo. The closest clean hit that he lands on Gojo ends up being blocked by the impact of his palm anyway, as the punch sends Gojo flying across the street, but he ends up regaining his footing by acrobatically landing on a traffic light some feet away. As Sukuna begins to approach Gojo, we see Mahoraga's wheel turn, as Gojo deduces that Mahoraga's wheel needs to turn 4 times in total before it has adapted to his infinity. So even in the face of the deadly countdown to Mahoraga adapting, Gojo remains confident that the time left was more than enough to kill Sukuna. So ever since the two of them had lost the ability to use their domains, Gojo had also stopped using all of his curse techniques outside of blue in order to prevent Mahoraga from adapting to those as well. So throughout all of these very well choreographed exchanges, Gojo was looking for the chance to use red or even purple in order to finish off Sukuna. So by the time that Gojo had gotten this chance, Mahoraga's wheel had already spun twice, meaning that Gojo only had a few seconds left to go until the final spin. After an extremely creative use of red, Gojo was able to avoid Sukuna's domain amplification, and he was able to land a full-powered blast of red behind Sukuna. This was the opening that Gojo had needed in order to land a devastating punch that by a fortunate turn of events had transformed into a black flash. This ends up knocking Sukuna out cold, which is freaking insane. And I love the fact that this chapter was prefaced with a discussion amongst the Jujutsu squad about how devastating Gojo's punches are. Now Gege continues to demonstrate how much he loves raining on Gojo's parade, because despite having knocked out Sukuna, Mahoraga's wheel falls to the ground and it makes its final ominous turn. And as if that wasn't enough, Sukuna somehow manages to summon Mahoraga while he is unconscious. Mahoraga then grabs Gojo and slashes him across the chest, showing us that Mahoraga has truly become immune to Gojo's infinity. It is this final development which begins to create some cracks in the confidence of Team Gojo. Even the story makes it clear here that Gojo was beginning to doubt if he could have actually won this fight. Now, funnily enough, Gojo had found the idea of him losing to be actually quite amusing, especially when you consider the fact that Gojo's immense strength had made him feel lonely. Despite Gojo's cursed energy output rapidly plummeting, this isn't enough to stop him, as he wastes no time in beating up Mahoraga. After a quick beatdown, Gojo begins the chant to activate red, but Sukuna quickly releases Mahoraga before he could fire it off. Now this move plays right into Gojo's hands, as he was looking for a way to draw out Sukuna from the shadows. So with a gateway into the shadows visible, Gojo does exactly what any sane person would do, as he fires a red curse technique right into this space. This forces Sukuna out, but so does Mahoraga, who now attacks Gojo along with Sukuna. Sukuna times his attack so well that he's able to squeeze some hits in while Mahoraga is negating infinity. He deals a major blow when he lands a piercing blood attack which wounds Gojo's arm. So Sukuna's game plan is pretty much to protect Mahoraga while Mahoraga attacks Gojo, and he also is going to use any opening in order to land attacks of his own. It's at this moment that you realize that Sukuna might not have just been aiming to protect Mahoraga, but he had also wanted to position himself into the best place where he could spectate on the fight. Because it seems as though he wants to see Mahoraga do something, and this appears to be excellent foreshadowing for something major that happens later on. So with Gojo now up against Mahoraga and Sukuna, he begins assessing the situation, and he admits that Sukuna is easily just as skilled as himself when it comes to using Jujutsu, and that he's really caught in a 2 versus 1 matchup with both Mahoraga and Sukuna up against him at the same time. Sukuna takes things up a notch by summoning Agito, a Shikigami that appears to be a fusion of multiple Shikigami. This transforms the playing field into an already unfair 2 versus 1 into a 3 versus 1. While the chapters for this fight were releasing, there were a myriad of fraud Kuna memes going around, because according to the memes, Sukuna would have been defeated long ago if not for the 10 shadows technique that he was borrowing from Megumi. And to be honest, I cannot help but to agree with these memes, especially with how poorly this part of the fight meshes with the conclusion of the fight. It's evident that at this point in the fight, we can all at least agree that Sukuna is a more skilled sorcerer than Gojo, considering that he has a far more refined domain expansion skill than Gojo. And even during the fight, Gojo does admit that Sukuna is just as skilled as he is. But even despite this, like I've mentioned several times in the video, Sukuna is clearly the worst fighter out of the two. I mean, look at how easily he gets clapped the second that the fight turns to hand-to-hand combat. So while it is evident that Sukuna did have a master plan, it's hard to think that he would have been able to execute on this plan without the help of Megumi's body. So back to the fight, Gojo once again begins to do his thing as he weaves through all of the trio's attacks with about the same level of ease as he did when he was fighting Sukuna 1 versus 1. Now unfortunately, it appears as though Mahoraga has now started to adapt to red as well. This means that Gojo was left with just 2 options: to either go big or to go home. And we all know exactly what Gojo decided to do. As for the big finale of the fight, what other way to end it all but to use Hollow Purple in order to completely eradicate Mahoraga and possibly even Sukuna. Meanwhile, the Jujutsu squad begin to lose hope in Gojo as they then even become discouraged from participating in the fight, which leaves Gojo with no other choice but to win this 3 versus 1 fight by himself. Even while dealing with a tag team of Agito and Mahoraga, Gojo still remains as dominant as he can be, as he casually punches holes in Agito's body and he knocks Mahoraga around quite a bit. It is honestly impressive how much Gojo is still in this fight even though so many variables were against him. So at this point, Sukuna had in fact retreated into the shadows again, and this time he was explicitly urging Mahoraga to show him what he wanted to see. Mahoraga appears to then literally slash Gojo's arm off, but in a manner that is similar to Sukuna's dismantle, since the attack was fired from a long range. Now, losing an arm was apparently nothing to Gojo, because he responds by erasing Agito from existence with blue and another black flash. And with a second black flash, Gojo gets a massive buff, with the chapter ending with the narrator stating that in 41 seconds, Gojo's Hollow Purple was going to ring through the city again. In the next chapter, Gojo's black flash buff raises his cursed energy output to the point that he casually regenerates his lost arm as he begins to make his final stand. Gege does his best here to gaslight us into thinking that Sukuna was actually afraid of losing here, with a comment about Sukuna being nervous, which honestly doesn't age well at all. Now Gojo on the other hand starts going to town on Sukuna and Mahoraga, and he lands 2 more black flashes in the process, which ramps up his cursed energy output even more. So after Gojo creates some distance between himself and his opponents, he begins to recite the chant for red. Expecting that Gojo was going to shoot off red like he normally does, Gojo surprisingly aims it upwards as Sukuna begins to visibly panic as he realizes what this means, and he screams for Mahoraga to go and stop it. Now this is where we find out that the blue technique that Gojo had used to destroy Agito hadn't entirely dissipated and it was still floating around in the air, meaning that once the red that Gojo fires off collides with the blue in the air, it would instantly create Hollow Purple. Sukuna knows all too well that this attack would be incredibly fatal, which is why he begins panicking. As Mahoraga nears it, Gojo uses Blue's attraction to pull himself between the Shikigami and its target, as he ends up landing a devastating punch in Mahoraga's face. Now at the same time, Sukuna tries to trigger red by detonating it with a blast of piercing blood, but Gojo uses the opportunity to strengthen Blue's gravitational pull, causing the piercing blood to get drawn into the blue sphere. Now with all of the pieces in place, Gojo begins to recite the chant for Hollow Purple, as both his red and blue curse technique collide and purple begins to erupt everywhere, and it engulfs all 3 combatants, and it completely incinerates Mahoraga and his wheel, along with a good number of buildings that are in the area. As Yuta witnesses all of this unfold, he admits to himself that he was wrong in thinking that he needed to go and help Gojo, because if Yuta was fighting alongside Gojo, then he wouldn't have been able to pull off such a deadly attack. Now when the dust settles, it reveals a severely damaged Sukuna who has almost no means of fighting back, and contrastingly we see a slightly wounded Gojo who appears to be already rapidly healing due to his black flash buff. So with that, it appears to have marked the end of their fight, as the narrator declares that Gojo has won, and so you could say that they live happily ever after, except that this isn't what happened. So we're about to go into the events of the next chapter, and there's nothing else to say but why. Why did Gege choose to end things like this? I mean, does he really hate Gojo this much? Regardless of how you look at it, the way that Gege had gone about this ended up making Gojo's death that much more impactful. It's quite a jarring experience when you turn over the page and see Gojo's lifeless dead body, and know the 2 of them didn't have an off-screen fight which led to Gojo's death. From seeing the positioning of Gojo's corpse, it appears as though he was dealt a fatal blow right at the moment where his victory was declared. So in actuality, we didn't miss anything here aside from seeing Sukuna fire off a spatial dismantle slash. So during the entire fight, Gojo was in fact the better fighter, but Sukuna had more skill with Jujutsu and he had a more convenient domain expansion. The entire fight was literally Sukuna picking off each and every single one of Gojo's deadliest abilities, as he then ends up acquiring an ability that could pierce through Gojo's infinity. Now Gojo on the other hand didn't have a game plan like Sukuna, as he was continuously playing with the cards that he was being dealt. which again honestly makes Gojo more of an impressive fighter in my opinion. Now, unlike some fans, I don't have too much of an issue with how Gege ended up killing Gojo. I would even go as far as to say that it was pretty well done. Now, the problem that I have arises from Gojo's statement that he makes during his afterlife sequence, where Gojo states that he lost to Sukuna without even getting him to go all out. Now, when I'd first read this line, I remember how absolutely infuriated I was by it. It felt like a slap in the face to Gojo and the absolute performance of a lifetime that he had just given. While it makes a lot of sense thematically that Gojo cannot be the one who gets to save Sukuna from his loneliness, but it feels extremely cheap to claim that a battle that was this dire and was this close was actually fought with Sukuna holding back for God knows whatever reason. But things honestly get even worse as Gojo states that he doubts that he could have beaten Sukuna even if he wasn't using the 10 Shadows curse technique. This is an unforgivably bad statement, and it looks even worse in retrospect, because the entirety of Sukuna's win was based on him having Megumi's 10 Shadows. Now that quite a number of chapters have been released since the conclusion of this fight, it's evident that Sukuna hasn't exhibited any new level of skill or power that appears to suggest that he was holding back during his battle against Gojo. After thinking about this for quite a long time, it's evident that Gege wanted to give Gojo the perfect send-off with him showing off why he was truly the strongest, but in the process it ended up making Sukuna look like such a fraud that he needed to save Sukuna's reputation by having Gojo claim that Sukuna wasn't going all out during their fight. And it's honestly no surprise as to why so many fans meme this aspect of the fight due to how ridiculous it is in hindsight. In isolation, this fight is easily the peak of Jujutsu Kaisen as a story, but its events and the implications of this fight feel so disconnected from the rest of the story that it makes everyone involved look really incompetent. Gojo ends up looking like a clown because he put on the show of a lifetime against an enemy who wasn't even going all out, and Sukuna looks like an even bigger clown for struggling so hard against an enemy that he wasn't taking seriously, and for some reason he didn't use his own power to defeat Gojo but had to rely on the 10 Shadows technique. This is all really frustrating because Gege didn't have to do this. I mean, Gojo could have been defeated without this entire afterlife statement. Gege could have also had Sukuna win in a way that didn't rely upon the 10 Shadows technique. And overall, Gege could have made Sukuna look a lot less pathetic in this fight. It's because of how Sukuna was portrayed which resulted in Gege doing this damage control with Gojo's final words. Despite having said all of this, I do acknowledge that the mystery of his unexplained curse technique still exists, but there's no real reason to justify why Sukuna hasn't used it yet. It's not believable when Gege tries to convince us that Sukuna is holding back when he continuously gets beaten to the point of desperation. If you want me to give you an analogy, it's like the equivalent of Aizen being beaten to hell by Ichigo, but then Kubo switches things up by telling us that Aizen was actually holding back the entire time, as he then ends up defeating Ichigo somehow with Yamamoto's Bankai. I mean, this is just how ridiculous this entire thing looks right now. It's unfortunate because I really do wish that Gege had committed to this generational fight instead of resorting to correcting the mistakes that he made by making Sukuna look so pathetic. So enough of the negativity, because I want to talk about the possibility of Gojo returning to the story. There are many theories online with fans speculating on how Gojo can make a return. Now, while fans really want to see Gojo be resurrected and to wipe the floor with Sukuna, personally I don't think that this is going to happen, because when you analyze Gojo's character, I really think he's someone who has been designed to fail. Now, if you look back at the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen, at what crucial point in the story has Gojo ever really pulled through? If you analyze everything chronologically from hidden inventory to the present timeline, then you'd realize that Gojo failed to save Riko, he fails to save Geto, and during the disaster of Shibuya, Gojo ended up being sealed away. He's then released to fight Sukuna, a task which he also fails and ends up being killed in the process. Gojo fails because he's this invincible figure of strength who ends up burdening himself with all of the responsibility, but in the process he ends up alienating himself from his fellow Jujutsu sorcerers. And with his inability to work together with others and to plan ahead of time, it results in him constantly failing, and this is all because of his individualistic nature. I mean, think about it, the only reason that Toji ended up killing Riko is because Gojo makes protecting her his sole responsibility and he burns out in the process of doing so. And then the downfall of Geto's character can be attributed to the alienation that he ended up feeling thanks to Gojo's immense strength. And then, not to mention, the disaster of Shibuya was only allowed to take place because Gojo once again took it upon himself to protect everyone, as he decided to face off against the cursed spirits by himself, but he ended up getting sealed in the process. Now this is unfortunately the deal with Gojo. Just when you need him the most, he will fail and let you down. There's a very interesting dynamic that exists between Sukuna and Gojo, where Sukuna uses his absolute strength to serve no one but himself. Gojo, on the other hand, secludes himself to the service of others, not paying any attention to his own self, and this is best illustrated in his own words when he had entrapped Jogo in Infinite Void. He states that once a person is given everything, they often find that they're unable to do anything, and that couldn't be more of a perfect representation of what Gojo is in the story. So unless this heading south statement means that Gojo is going to be reborn or is going to come back as a curse or with a special binding vow, it's yet to be proven that he's going to be returning in the story. And honestly, I wouldn't hold my breath on it because Gege is notoriously known for hating on Gojo. Now this may come as a shock to you, but Gojo is not the protagonist of Jujutsu Kaisen, it is Yuji. Yuji at the end of the day is the true antithesis to Sukuna. So with Sukuna accepting the challenge to destroy Yuji's ideals, it's a sign that Sukuna is on the verge of realizing that there is more to life than just acquiring absolute strength. Now this is something that Gojo had failed to do because he was living by a similar ideal to Sukuna. Now this is why Gojo's death feels so liberating, as it frees him from the burden of being the strongest, as finally he was challenged by someone who was able to defeat him. So that was my breakdown of Gojo versus Sukuna. What do you guys think about this very controversial fight? While again it is one of the peaks of Jujutsu Kaisen, its finale ends up making it a very highly debated topic amongst Jujutsu Kaisen fans. Are you happy with the end to Gojo's story, or do you think that Gojo is going to return in some way? Do you agree with my opinion on how Gojo's character was cheapened with his final statement, and how Gege had tried to recover the character of Sukuna by making Gojo admit that he wasn't able to get Sukuna to go all out against him? Honestly, are the memes about fraud Kuna true? Definitely let me know by continuing the discussion in the comments, and let me know if you think that Sukuna is actually holding anything back. I'd love to know all of your thoughts. And lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and I cannot wait to see you in my next Jujutsu Kaisen video. A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.